Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Moore, and I am the Program Director of the National Conference of State Legislatures Immigrant Policy Project and the Task Force on Immigration for States. NCSL has been focused on the state and local role in immigrant policy since 1992, providing research and analyses on federal immigration policy, state and local innovative programs, and state legislation related to immigrants. Please visit our website at www.ncsl.org/IN. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on immigration enforcement measuring the metrics. NCSL gratefully acknowledges the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation for sponsoring this webinar. Today's webinar is the second in the Immigrant Policy Project's 2015 webinar series. Our next webinar will be held on May 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern, focusing on immigrants in the workforce. Please visit our website, ncsl.org/imig, to register for free. We value your feedback. After each webinar, please fill out our survey to let us know what was valuable and how we can do better. Today, we will hear from Teresa Cardinal-Brown from the Bipartisan Policy Center to discuss metrics that can provide a set of comprehensive outcome-based measures, as well as a discussion of state rules and legislation related to immigration enforcement. We will hold a question and answer session following our presentation. For those joining us via the web, please feel free to use the chat box on the lower left part of your screen to submit any questions. We have provided resources for you as well that you may download at any time during this webinar. Simply click on the Media Library icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, which looks like a yellow piece of paper with a blue bar graph in front of it, and you will find a list of documents that you may download. Now, let me welcome Teresa Cardinal-Brown. Teresa has more than 20 years of experience in immigration law, policy, and government relations with law firms, associations, and serving in the government. Her government career includes serving in the Office of the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, on Secretary Chertow's second stage review of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and as Director of the Immigration Legislation Task Force for the Department of Homeland Security Office of Policy. She has also served as the first DHS Director of Canadian Affairs and the first DHS attaché at the Embassy of the United States in Ottawa, working in the areas of Homeland Security, Immigration and Border Policy and Operations, Law Enforcement and Public Safety, Transportation, and Trade. Teresa is also the Director of Immigration and Border Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Associate Director of Business Immigration Advocacy at the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and worked in the immigration practices of large Washington, D.C.-based law firms. She joined the Bipartisan Policy Center and her own consulting firm, Cardinal Strategies, LLC, where she specialized in policy, legislative and regulatory affairs regarding immigration, homeland security, border security and management, cross-border travel and trade, emergency management and response, and information exchange for counterterrorism and law enforcement. These are just a few highlights of her many storied career. You can find Teresa's full bio online on our information webinar page. Now let's get started. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ann, and thank you to those of you who are joining us today. I will talk a little bit today about the report. This presentation is based on a report that we published within the last month, looking specifically at issues of immigration enforcement and border security and how well the government does or doesn't do in this case of providing ways of measuring that, and how we can all do a better job at trying to understand the state of border security in this country and how the government can help us by providing good metrics to that effect. So I'll first do a brief overview of the Bipartisan Policy Center for those who aren't familiar with our organization. I'm going to speak a little bit to an overview of the aspects of immigration enforcement and how they fit together in federal government, and then talk a little bit about measurements, how we define measurements, how we measure outcomes, how we need to look at the migrant flows and incentives for coming. So very quickly, while I'm talking to you about the Bipartisan Policy Center, we want to take advantage of one of the webinar features and put up a poll. So if you look in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a quick poll, and we'll get to the results of this poll. But if while I'm talking now, you take a moment to answer the poll, that would be great. We're basically asking, what is your perception of whether illegal immigration to the United States has gone up, is about the same, or is less since the beginning of this decade, around 2003. So go ahead and vote there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the Bipartisan Policy Center is a Washington, D.C. think tank. It was founded in 2007 by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Howard Baker, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, and George Mitchell. And the role of the Bipartisan Policy Center is somewhat unique in Washington. We are not a nonpartisan think tank. There are many of those that look at doing objective research and trying to stay above sort of the political fray. There are think tanks in Washington that can be affiliated with one or the other side of the political aisle. But the role of the BPC is and has been to bring together partisans, people who are, fiercely proud of their partisan stripes, together to try to work toward pragmatic solutions that actually have a chance of politically seeing the light of day to some really complicated problems. And immigration is one of those. Our immigration task force was formed in 2013. And it's led by former governors Haley Barbour and Ed Rendell, who also happen to be former chairs of the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee. Former HUD Secretary under President Clinton, Henry Cisneros, and former Secretary of State under George Bush, Condoleezza Rice. Other task force members include other secretaries, Secretary Michael Chertoff, former DHS Secretary, Secretary Lisa Lees, former Labor Department Secretary. We have immigrant advocates and business people. We have former members of Congress from Arizona and California. So it's really a good bipartisan group of people who have a very significant interest in the immigration debate. And what they have sought to do is to come together and sort of looking at the frameworks of immigration reform that have been proposed in Congress and see if there are ways on a bipartisan basis we can help further those goals, to look at bipartisan solutions addressing the major pillars of immigration reform, one of which is and has been securing the border. And all of the members of our task force firmly believe that that needs to be part of immigration reform. But I would say that securing the border is one of those things that frankly tends to be in the eye of the beholder. It's not clearly defined. It's not well understood. And so people tend to make of it what they will, and that's been one of the hardest issues for immigration reform. If people are of the opinion that we need to, quote, secure the border first, there's very little definition around that. So one of the things the task force asked us to do is to try to define that. How do we define what a secure border looks like? More importantly, how do we even try to measure that? So we are trying to, what we did this report was to try to see, well, what kinds of things about the border have been measured before, how well do they do at describing the state of things, and how can we do a better job of getting this information out into the public so that everybody can have sort of a common understanding of where the state of the border lies. And that gets me to the poll question that we put forward. So one of the reasons I asked folks whether or not you thought that it's about the same, less, or more, and I see we're about evenly split. About 45% say it's about the same, 45% say it's less, and about 10% saying it's more. So that's very interesting. There was a poll that was done a little while ago, about in the last year or so, that polled the general public. And the majority of the general public did believe that actually we are seeing more unlawful immigration now than we had since 2003. But the fact of the matter is that based on the available data we have, there's actually been lower levels of increase of illegal immigration in the last 2 or 3 years than at any time since the 1970s. In fact, the Pew Hispanic Center has estimated that net migration from Mexico has been 0 for each of the last 2 years. So there is a gap between how the public perceives the state of the border and how those who are looking at it see it as the reality of where we are in immigration enforcement. And so what we hope to do is see if we can close that gap and get people all on the same page. So very briefly, immigration enforcement has risen significantly in the last half century. Since 1975, it's risen tremendously, about tenfold. And in fiscal year 2013, the year to which we measured, it's more than half of all federal law enforcement spending is spent on related immigration enforcement programs. Now, the immigration enforcement apparatus at the federal level spans several government departments. The majority of it is part of the Homeland Security Department. That includes Customs and Border Protection, which is responsible for managing and operating the ports of entry, as well as including the Border Patrol that patrols between the ports of entry and our waterways. But DHS also includes Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is responsible for apprehension and removal of those who are unlawfully present in the United States, as well as investigating immigration fraud and other immigration-related crimes. The Coast Guard in Homeland Security also has a role to play in guarding our coastal waterways from illegal immigration, particularly those that generate in the Caribbean, but also on the west and east coast. The Justice Department actually houses the immigration courts. So the judges that hear cases of individuals who are seeking relief from removal or looking for asylum, those are part of the Department of Justice. And of course, our State Department operates as embassies and consulates abroad that issue visas to people who want to come to the United States. But when we're looking at the state of immigration enforcement, we look at what the agencies have collected and reported. And in general, they've reported some statistics that are relevant to border security, but they haven't done a consistent job at it, and they haven't done a regular job at it. And so that's led to some of the confusion. For example, most frequently when we hear about metrics related to border security, we tend to hear what we call input. That is, how many miles of fence do we have? How many Border Patrol agents? How many radar towers or surveillance equipment do we have? We might hear a little bit of output statistics. So, for example, the number of apprehensions, people caught by the Border Patrol, that's an output statistic. Or the number of people who have been removed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Those are relevant statistics, but they still don't tell the whole story. What we don't have is anything that tracks the same performance over time, and that tells us how we're doing toward the national goals of reducing the levels of unlawful migration and unlawful immigration in the United States. So in the 1980s and 90s, before Homeland Security was created, when it was still the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the government and some outside researchers put some efforts into trying to come up with some of these measurements. For example, how could we measure how many people we don't catch who are trying to come into the country unlawfully? And we also could, they also looked at how do we measure or estimate the number of people who are living in the country unlawfully at a given time. And they've developed some methodologies, frankly, most of which are still used today. They've been refined over time, and they're very much widely accepted as good methodologies for making these estimates. But as I said, the government hasn't really reported these regularly. For example, only in the last 15 years, we have seen 4 different measurements for how well we are doing at securing the southwest border. The government has adopted a measure, and then the next fiscal year, a couple of years later, decided that's not what they wanted to measure, and then they dropped it. I'm seeing a note that I need to mute my computer speakers, but they are muted. So let me see if I can. Okay, need people to tell me if I'm still echoing. Okay, hopefully I'm not echoing anymore. I apologize for that. All right, so we'll just go on to the next slide here. So as I said, this gives you a level of the share of enforcement resources that has gone to immigration enforcement of all federal government spending, and this is in real dollars. So as you can see, it was fairly steady, and then obviously after 9/11 it's increased. But as a share, it's up. It's been a variation, but this does not include the amount spent by USCIS, which is the agency that processes these applications. So it's been really close to 50%, and it's just now under 50% now. So we talked about input measures and we talked about output measures, but what we really want the government to report is outcome measures. And those are the measures that really assess the extent to which what we have done has progressed us toward our enforcement goals. And why is that needed? Well, it's really needed so we can inform both decision-making by the government as to how to allocate the resources they're given, but also to educate the public debate over immigration enforcement. If we want a secure border to be part of our immigration reform legislation, how do we define that, and how do we know how far we have to go to get there? So that's why these measures are really important to come up with. So what we did, I just another quote. We had an event on Monday where we talked about the report, and Border Patrol Chief Fisher was there, and I think it was him or maybe Paul Anstine from House Homeland Security Committee, when talking about the existing measures that people usually see, like the number of apprehensions. He said basically a measure that is good, whether it goes up or goes down, is not a really good measure. And when it comes to looking at border security, we have a lot of those. So for example, apprehensions. Well, you know, the government will say, well, if apprehensions are going up, that's great. That means we're catching more people. If apprehensions are going down, that's great. That means we're deterring more people and less people are coming in. But that may not be true. When apprehensions are going up, it just may be that more people are coming in, but we're catching the same percentage of them. Or when apprehensions are going down, it may be that we're catching a lower percentage of the same number of people trying. So it doesn't really tell us the right answer of where we are at the state of border. In order to be useful, this is what the Government Accounting Office and experts in performance-based measurement say outcome-based measures should be. They should be meaningful, clear, and readily understandable. One of the issues we have seen in the immigration debate over the last couple of years is that people debate the meaning of the metrics that are put out. They argue over what the apprehension rate means or the apprehension level means. Even with the number of removals that the government has made, people will debate whether that's, you know, are they measuring the right thing or what's included in that. So clearly, they're not clear, meaningful, or readily understandable now. They should be based on objective methodologies that enjoy a scientific consensus. So even if you're estimating something that you can't measure directly, if you can explain how you arrived at a methodology to estimate that, if that methodology has been used widely in the field, for example, the ways that we estimate the number of unauthorized people in the United States is based on a method called the Residual Method that looks at census data and then subtracts out those people we know who are lawful immigrants, those people we know are temporary immigrants, and sort of assumes that the remainder, the residual, are going to be unlawful. Now that methodology has been around since the mid-'80s. It has been widely peer-reviewed and frankly is the one that is most commonly used now. So it's pretty objective, and most people say that that's a consensus way of estimating things. As long as you're consistent with whatever you choose to use and the methodologies are well known, you can use that as a measure. It needs to be derived from good data. And the data needs to be clear, and it needs to be not biased or distorted, so you need to look at, are you measuring it objectively? And over time, it needs to be consistently reported. The same data collected the same way over time. When you change how you collect it or how you report it, then you introduce levels of uncertainty about what it all means again. It needs to be timely. So, you know, for example, DHS annually estimates the number of unlawful immigrants in the United States, unauthorized immigrants in the United States, but they haven't published an estimate in over a year for the last year. Well, private researchers at Pew have already done theirs. It's unclear why the government is taking so long to do it. So it should be timely. And again, stability over time. Whatever measures you pick, continue to measure them over time. That's the only way you can know from year to year whether you're improving or not in getting toward your goal. So what we did in our report is with those ideas in mind of what an outcome-based measure should be, we looked at those measures that the government is already doing or that are being used in the research community, the scientific community outside of the government. We looked at those measures that are relevant to immigration for the border, and we focused on immigration. I'll talk about that in a minute. There are other things that need to be measured at the border as well, but we focused on the immigration measures. And that addressed all the methods, we call them inflows or entry channels, by which people can enter the unauthorized population in the United States. So what you see on this slide is our suggestions of what can be measured and reported or estimated with strong probability now, and if taken together and measured over time and reported annually, would give everybody a common understanding of where we are with regard to immigration enforcement and how we're doing with the resources we have invested. So the first metric, as you see at the top there, is overall effectiveness. And that's generally the number of unauthorized immigrants residing in the United States. So if measured or estimated year to year, is it going up, is it going down, is it about the same? That reflects the overall goal that we're trying to achieve. Then, that population is affected both by new people coming in and people leaving. So then we look to how do new people come in? Well, there's a total inflow of people coming in, but they also come in three major ways. And this is really important. We tend to focus on what happens between the ports of entry, mostly at the southwest border. But unlawfully present immigrants have come in and do come in three major ways. They do come in between the ports of entry, whether that's at the southwest border or along the coast or sometimes from the U.S.-Canada border. That's one way. They also come in through the ports, and they come in through the ports either by using fraudulent documents or making claims to eligibility to enter that are not true, or concealment. Secretary Chertoff was here earlier this morning, and he recalled one of his first trips to the southwest border actually seeing a compartment encased in the dashboard of a car at San Ysidro, California, where a person had been folded into this compartment in a dashboard to sneak across the border. It's very common to see people hiding in large semi-tractor trailer trucks coming across the border. So concealment is another way people come in at the ports of entry. And then the third way is they come in legally. They have been issued a visa overseas or come in our visa waiver programs for visits, for students, for work, or whatever. And then when the term of their visa expires, they just don't leave. And those are called overstays. And that's the other third way that people can join the unauthorized population in the United States. And there is at least some estimates that say that that could account for as much as 40% of the unauthorized population in the United States. Then we also need to look at the ways people leave the population. One way is by government removal, those who are apprehended in the country and are removed by the government from the United States. Some portion of those who are unauthorized in the United States are able to adjust to a lawful status. Under our current immigration laws, there are certain ways that people who may have been unauthorized can obtain waivers or other means that they can actually apply for and obtain a lawful status, and so that are no longer counted among the unauthorized population. Some decide at some point that they want to go back home, and so they leave of their own accord. And lastly but not least, some portion may die while they're here, and so then they are no longer counted. But we feel that it's important. You need to measure all of these things, and you need to measure them independently, in part because by measuring all of the component parts of these things, you can determine how best to allocate resources. For example, if we know that maybe 40% of the unauthorized population has come in as overstays, and we are willing to invest in a system that allows us to track that, what impact then on the number of new overstays will that investment have? What impact will that have on the overall unauthorized population? So if we reduce the number of overstays, but the entry between the ports rises, we haven't changed the total unauthorized population. So being able to measure these things separately allows us to evaluate the impact of each of our allocation of resources. So as I said, when we measure migrant flows, we need to measure all of these channels by which they enter and an overall estimate. So for example, one of the primary outcome measures at a port of entry or between a port of entry is the number of successful unauthorized border crossings. Now, these are people that aren't trying to be noticed. They're not trying to be caught. So how do you measure somebody who doesn't want to be caught? Well, you have to estimate that. And what we're looking to do, the way you do that is you estimate the probability that someone who is trying to enter unlawfully between the port or at the port will be caught. There are different ways to do that based on data that's already collected. One way is using the recidivism rate. This is a rate that the Border Patrol uses and CBP has, where they look at the percentage of the people they apprehend who have crossed more than once, that they have apprehended before. So this is based on a theory that says that most unlawful immigrants, if they are caught and returned, will attempt to come back again. And so by understanding that and the recidivism rate, you can estimate what the probability of them getting caught on each try might be. Another way to estimate this is using what's called known flow data. And this is, the Border Patrol calculates this. This is how you know, how you basically figure out how many people are trying to come in. And they do that by the number of people they catch, but also the number of people they know that they have seen try to come in but then turn back. They go back into Mexico and they don't make that attempt. Or how many people they believe have, quote, got away. What is that? Well, Border Patrol has a lot of ways of surveilling the border to see whether there are people attempting to cross. They have cameras, they have radars, they have unattended aerial systems, unmanned aerial systems. They also go out regularly and what they do called sign cutting, where they look at the terrain and they look for signs that people or groups of people have crossed, and they estimate how many people those surveillance hits, if you will, account for. And so the known flown data is the total of all of those to get the number of people they think are trying to come in. The last major way to estimate the probability of apprehension is through surveys. And there are long-standing surveys, particularly of Mexican migrants, that have been done by academic institutions in the United States and in Mexico for many, many years. And these surveys are very well known in the research community. Their methodologies are very well established, and they interview migrants who have been to the United States and either been apprehended and turned back or have been living in the United States and returned, and ask them questions. How many times did it take you to get in? How many tries did you make? How long did it take? Those kinds of questions. And again, from that we can get an estimate of the probability of apprehension. At the ports of entry, CBP does randomized inspections. So obviously a CBP officer at a port of entry can ask someone that they have suspicions of whether they should be allowed in the country to go into further examination. But on a randomized basis, they will also take people who have been told by the officer at the booth that they're allowed to come in, take them into secondary and ask another series of questions to see basically that primary officer got it right. Based on that secondary data, they make an estimate of how many people they think may have entered unlawfully through the ports of entry. In other words, CBP made a mistake either in admitting them or there was somebody concealed that they didn't catch. So they have that data, but they have never made that data public. And then the Department and State Department also have information about the number of people they believe have overstayed visas based on the exit data that they collect from travelers at air and seaports and now at land borders with the U.S. and Canada, and some at the land borders with Mexico. So these are the various ways that we think that they need to be measured. Now, to give you an example, I'm going to skip ahead a chart here. So we talked about the probability of apprehension. This is an estimate. If you use those various ways of calculating the probability of apprehension, this chart will show you, and I'll just get my pointer here, what kind of measurements you can estimate. So for example, using the MMP, which is the Mexican Migration Project Survey, you get this line here, which says that the probability of apprehension at the port estimated based on that survey varies from about 35% in 1979 to, in 2009, as high as 50%. Okay? Another survey that's done of Mexican migrants, this one shows a higher, over 50%, maybe about 55% probability of apprehension. The known flow data that CBP collects, they show a much higher probability of apprehension when you estimate it using that data. One of the reasons is that this only measures those attempts that CBP knows about. So if somebody comes through completely undetected, no signs, they won't be counted in the denominator of that equation for CBP's data. So it is understandable why their estimates are much higher than others. But as you can see, using the data available, you can get an estimate, and you could average all these out. There's pros and cons to any one of these methodologies, but you could average all these out to get a general understanding where things are, and you can measure it year over year to see if it's getting better or worse. One of the reasons it's important to do all of this, and to also know, we could throw all kinds of resources at the border, and we can see the outputs, the outcomes using these kind of measures. But what we do is only one part of the migrant's decision to come. And one of the things that border enforcement is attempting to do is maximize deterrence. And deterrence is the chance that an immigrant who has either decided to come tries and doesn't try again, or doesn't try the first time after arriving at the border, or what we call beyond the border or behind the border deterrence, where they think that it's not worth their trying to come in the first place. Well, there are a lot of factors that go into those decisions. And one of the questions is, what's the right level of deterrence? Well, you want to get to a point, we have an optimal level of deterrence that the apprehension rate, or the probability of apprehension, is high enough that a lot of them will not try in the first place. How do we know where that is? Well, we will know that by all of these measurements. We can measure the probability of apprehension. We can estimate then the number of people we think have successfully come in unlawfully, and we can measure over time whether that's going better or that's getting better or worse. But there are other factors, like the likelihood of gaining employment if they successfully cross. Well, that gets to other factors of enforcement, like our interior enforcement system or employment verification. And what are the chances of apprehension inside the country if they successfully cross? And we also need to understand that there are things that we don't control at all. The economic factors in the countries where they come from, crime or persecution in their home countries, the desire to reunite with families that are already here. Those are factors that our government resources are not able to impact, but they are part of the migrant decision. And so it's relevant for us to understand that we can get to the optimal level of deterrence, and we can do what we need to do to disincentivize inside the country, but that still may not be enough at any given time to affect the flow of migration if these other factors are very strong. So, very quickly in conclusion, as you can see, I've just packed a lot of information in a short period of time, but metrics are important, and they're important primarily so that everyone can have a common picture of the state of the border. Everyone can understand exactly where things stand and can make appropriate decisions based on that. I mentioned earlier this report that we did focused primarily on immigration metrics. But obviously, there are other missions that happen at the borders. Our government is charged with preventing drug smuggling, with addressing transnational criminal activity, other types of contraband that is unlawful, whether it be money or guns or fake goods that come in at our ports of entry. But there are also important collateral issues to look at when we address our enforcement needs at the border, such as the impact of those enforcement activities on the local communities. All of those are also important to measure, but one of the things I do want to emphasize is you don't necessarily want to combine everything into one giant measurement. At some point in 2012 and 2013, the Department of Homeland Security attempted to come up with something they called a Border Conditions Index, which would have been a combination of a lot of these different factors that would coalesce into a single number that would somehow tell you the state of the border. We actually think that that's not very helpful to the overall debate. One is it doesn't tell you the impact of activities addressing one or the other of these border missions on the others. For example, we could make a concerted effort to stop unlawful immigration and find that we are letting a lot more drugs in, or vice versa. So things that we do to address one or the other mission may have collateral impacts on the other, and if we combine everything into a single index, we don't see those interactions as well. The other main point that we want to point out is that in spite of arguments that a lot of people have that this is just unmeasurable because these are people who don't want to be measured, there is sufficient data out there. A lot of it is governmental data, but there's also a lot of really good work that's done outside of the government. I mentioned the migration surveys, and researchers would very much like to work with the government, with their data, to come up with better methodologies, even better methodologies to estimate all of these things. So if DHS and the other government agencies would find a way to allow researchers to access this data, they could do a better job of telling the story of what's actually happening along the border. And Congress can mandate this. I think DHS is actually coming slowly to this realization on its own, and they have been doing some outreach to some researchers of late. So I think they're starting to get an understanding of the need to do this as well. But in general, the main reason we think this is important is because having this information can lead to better discussions and better decisions about what we are spending at the border and its impact. And at the end of the day, to the extent that this border security is an inherently important issue for immigration reform to proceed, it is invaluable for everybody to have a common understanding of where we are at the border. So in the very short time, that is the summary. You can find this report along with a lot of other of our informational issue briefs and blogs that we've done at the website you see on your screen now. You're welcome to reach out to me after this webinar with questions, and my email is there, and I'm also on Twitter. And with that, I think we will open it up for questions.
Thanks, Teresa. So with that, I will open it up to the audience for questions. Please use the chat box in the lower left part of your screen to submit any questions. And while we wait, I will pose the first question. Teresa, legislators from border states know that the border is complex. It's important for national security protection and to protect against crimes such as trafficking in guns, drugs, and people. But the border is also important for trade and economic development and connects families and neighborhoods of the U.S. border with Canada and Mexico. How can this tool, these border metrics, help to better manage the border?
Oh, thank you for that. That's an interesting question. First of all, what I would say is, as I mentioned, there are a lot of things that happen at the border that all should be measured. We talk a lot about the immigration metrics here, but we make the point in the paper that everything needs to be measured. We need to measure the efficiency of our ports for legal travel and trade. So that's a very important measure because so much of our economy depends on that trade with Canada and Mexico that happens through our ports of entry. So that's one of the things that we also should be measuring. We need to look at, as I said, the impact of our enforcement on the state and local communities in the border regions, and are they seeing increases or decreases in crime or property crimes in their area, and just the impact of how is civil society relating to the enforcement resources that have been put on the border. Some places the relationship is pretty good, and others not so much. So how can the government do a better job at those? Those are really important things to also look at and also measure. And for a comprehensive picture of the border, you need to look at all of those. We wanted, as I said, we focus primarily on the immigration issue because that's the project I'm related to. But we definitely believe that the government needs to do a better job at talking about all of these things. And I think it is important, especially for those who reside in border states, to help that picture get made, not just for themselves and with the government, but so those states that aren't on the border can have a better understanding of what the border is and how it looks like. I'm sure that many people who live in border states are very, very frustrated by some of the rhetoric and statements that they hear coming from members of Congress from non-border states about the state of the border. And so, that level of understanding needs to permeate so that those who will have a say in what happens at the border but don't live there are at least operating from a base of knowledge that is consistent and objective over time.
Great. Thank you for that answer. A question that just came in is, what are some policy options that the BPC has developed to improve the role of states in immigration enforcement?
So that's a very interesting question. What we have suggested, our task force that's looked at this hasn't looked, I'd say, in depth at the role of states in the immigration enforcement. But what they have said is that states need to be able to sort of decide for themselves what they want to do. So there are certain programs in law right now that allow, for example, state and local law enforcement to cooperate with the federal government in enforcement in various ways. And different states and localities have chosen whether or not they want to engage with those. There are some states that have chosen not to engage with the federal government at all because they see public safety issues impacted by the fact of their cooperation with the federal government on immigration issues. A lot of that is a result, frankly, of us not having a coherent federal immigration policy. It has devolved to the states to deal with the impacts of this, and states have grappled with it in various ways. And so I think where we come at it is that it remains imperative on Congress, it remains imperative on our federal government to develop and implement a cohesive immigration policy, and that's got to happen through immigration legislation. Congress has to be the one to do that. That needs to address all the parts of our system. yes, it needs to address border security, but it also needs to address our legal immigration system. I mentioned Secretary Chertoff is one of the members of our task force, and he said very, very clearly that in order to secure the border for immigration purposes, we need to have better legal channels for people to come in. They're coming in that way because there isn't a lawful mechanism for them to enter to work where there are jobs available and Americans are not available to do those jobs. So the fact of the matter is that we have a legal immigration system that has not been updated in terms of categories of people who can come in and numbers of people who can come in since 1990. And that's long time. Our economy and our economic needs have long since passed that framework that was adopted in 1990. So clearly we need to adjust our legal immigration system. And then, you know, hopefully you'll have people coming through legal channels, and the amount of resources and enforcement that we need to put toward unlawful to preventing unlawful immigration is much, much smaller. And we're dealing then with, you know, criminal elements and people who are here to not do any good, possibly do us harm. So I think that that's really where we are focused, is how do we get the federal government to address this issue? Because clearly we see that states and localities are in the position of having to do it whether they want to or not. And what we see here is states they're addressing it in lots of different ways, creating inconsistencies across the country in how we deal with immigration.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Hearing no more questions, that concludes today's webinar on immigration enforcement, measuring the metrics. NCSL thanks the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation for sponsoring this event. I would like to thank Teresa Brown for the informative and helpful presentation. For those that joined late and for those that would like to listen again, NCSL will be posting a recording of today's webinar online early next week. As a reminder, our next webinar in our 2015 Immigration Webinar Series will be held on Friday, May 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern, focusing on immigrants in the workforce. For additional details on how to register, please visit ncsl.org/IMMIG. You will be receiving an email shortly directing you to a short survey, and we ask that you please complete it as we value your feedback. Additionally, for those that have not already done so, I would highly encourage you to register for NCSL's 2015 Legislative Summit on August 3rd through 6th in Seattle, Washington at ncsl.org. This concludes today's webinar, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Have a great weekend.